Compañeros, welcome to another edition of the SQL Data Partners Podcast. I am Carlos Chacon, your host, and I am joined today by Eugene Meininger.
Howdy.
And Mr. Kevin Fiesel.
Hello.
And this is episode 245 as we edge closer to what I'm sure will be infamous episode 250, which we probably ought to start thinking about now.
I mean, now I'm looking forward to 256.
Yeah, that's a truly round number.
Oh, that's true. That would be.
You'll have to pick. Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense.
Carlos is going to have to change the database because all the episodes were tiny int.
Yeah, that's right.
Most podcasts don't make it this far, so it's understandable.
We are blazing a trail here.
Making our way to small int.
Okay, so our topic today is tooling updates. So Timmy Ocean put out a blog post for new tooling with Azure Data Studio and SQL Server Management Studio, and so it made me wonder. Admittedly, I don't know that I keep up with all the little changes that have happened in Management Studio. And so I wanted to go through those, take a peek at what's changed through, and we're only going to go SQL Server or SSMS 18. That's our limit. I'm sure we wanted to go back further, but that's what we're going to be talking about today. And then there are some pieces for the Azure Data Studio, and that's where we hope to get some insights from Kevin and Eugene. Now, I am curious, compañeros, as always, if you hear this, I am curious, reach out to me if there is a must-have update that you have had in SQL Server Management Studio or Azure Data Studio. I'm very interested to know. So we're going to talk about some of these today, but if you're like, oh man, like now that I have this, my life is complete, right. I'm super interested. Do either of you have one of those to start us off?
No.
Okay.
Something that's changed my life?
That's changed your life.
No, I am starting to 2 years late, starting to get excited about notebooks in general. So I'm one of those late
we will
adopters.
get there. So hold on there. We will get there. So
no, let's talk about general ledger, right? Just ledger, centralized, decentralized ledgers.
Yeah. So the show notes for today's episode are going to be at SQLDataPartners.com/tooling updates with an S, or at SQLDataPartners.com/245. Now, compañeros, do you want a second pair of eyes on your SQL Server environment? We can help you review your system and be available for any nagging questions you might have. Schedule your database health assessment at SQLDataPartners.com. You'll be glad you did. Now, we are in the midst of our seasonal series. We're actually going back to SQL Server 101, we called it. Some of that first session was really more like level 100. But if you find yourself with nothing to do on Thursdays at 1 p.m. Eastern, be sure to check out the SQL Trail seasonal series. I feel like conference season has begun and then kind of stopped all of a sudden. Like there were lots of things in March, and then what's next on y'all's horizon?
So for me, SQL Saturday Jacksonville coming up in just a couple of weeks.
Oh, yeah.
It's May 15th. It's the Sunday after Mother's Day. There are also a couple other SQL Saturdays on the list. Haven't had official selections there. So
did you submit to Jersey?
I will.
Okay.
I will submit to Jersey, and there's another one that I will submit to as well. Also be going to that conference in Wisconsin in July.
Oh, very nice. Are you speaking?
Yes. It'll be the first time
Nice.
I'll be there. It's a very interesting dev conference. So looking forward to it.
That's the one at the water park, right?
That is one of the ones at the Kalahari. Yep.
Yeah.
Code Mash in Ohio, also at the Kalahari, except that's in January.
Gotcha.
And so I don't know, water park in January might not be quite as nice.
Yeah, it's still a good time. I got to speak there once, and I did not realize it was a water park at the time. So my spouse had to like run up some swim trunks and spent the day with me that week because I got there. I'm like, oh, that's what this is. Okay. I thought it was just like a themed hotel or something, not like a whole resort kind of deal.
It's a whole resort.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to do Jacksonville, but I had a conflict. So I'm hoping to submit to Jersey and do that. Maybe even drive there. I don't know. We'll see. And then I submitted to Pass Summit. I'll be going one way or the other. But like 500 people. So, no, I don't know. It was like 500 submissions and 300 people or some huge amount. So we'll see I don't expect to get in, but
sure. So that came up quick. Like I saw the announcement. I must have missed the initial announcement because like the first time I saw it, it was like, oh, by the way, it ends, this week or whatever. And I'm like, oh, I need to get that in. And then I was traveling, and then the next thing I know, submissions are over. Like,
yeah. So this time they didn't come back to us and be like, hey, we need you to do a learning path again.
No, they did not ask us
Oh,
to do the learning path. So they,
either they've got things better organized or we did really badly. I'm hoping it's the first one, right?
Let's hope. Well, I think Kathy could also be in the, let's just change things up. Let's, give somebody else a chance kind of a thing.
Makes sense to me.
At least that's my story. I'm sticking to it.
Absolutely.
Okay. So compañeros, we don't have any shout outs for today. I'm sorry. We will get those to you next week. So let's go ahead and jump in. So new tooling. So there are two flavors of this, and I'm actually going to start with SQL Server Management Studio 18. Now there are lots and lots of bug fixes, and I'll admit that I didn't go through with a fine-tooth comb to find all of them. But spoiler, right? Most of the enhancements are in relation to Azure services.
Right.
Shock. Shocker there. So I'm going back in proceeding order. So they just did what? So 1811 is what they just released. Well, I say just is the most recent one, which came out in March. As I want to say.
End of February, beginning of March. Yeah.
End of February. Okay. Yeah. I don't have a date here. Anyway, so the last update was in March, but and so the big tout is ledger tables, which admittedly were actually new to me. So apparently now you can create ledger tables in Management Studio. So we should pause there and talk a little bit about ledger tables. Have you either of you two dug into those?
No, if I roll my eyes any harder, it will actually be painful.
Because not a fan, you just
not a fan.
Not a fan. Okay. This is a security kind of
well, it's just like who are you securing it from, right? That's the thing, right? Go ahead.
Yeah, it's something that I think is worth its own full discussion because I'm not going to give it the benefit of objective analysis. I'm just going to come at it hard in opposition. So that's not fair to ledger tables. Okay. But I think it's worth a detailed discussion later. There are specific use cases where ledger tables can be very useful.
Yeah.
You're probably not in one of those.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the big thing is that a lot of the whole thing about blockchain, all this kind of stuff, assumes kind of an adversarial data storage environment, right? Like the whole idea with a lot of this blockchain stuff is you want various actors or people to be able to contribute, but you don't quite trust any of them, right?
Gotcha.
Which starts to fall apart whenever you're the DBA and you control the entire stack, right? And so there's some problems it can solve, especially like theoretically around data corruption or validating changes or all that kind of stuff. But yeah, not what is it? There's a marketplace podcast called like Make Me Smart, and they do like half full, half empty. So okay. I think we're half empty on ledger tables.
Okay, very good. So it is defense. It's in public preview, right? So it's
Yeah, I think the issue I think is that it feels a lot like stretch tables of like 2016 or whatever, right? Oh, you know what I mean? Sure. Like I just it feels like it's probably them trying to hop onto the under the latest buzzword kind of thing. Like if it turns into something, awesome, but we will see.
Gotcha. Yeah. So we talked about, security, tamper evidence, the capabilities, and again, the early examples is they're comparing them to temporal tables. So
right.
Anyway, so that is, so now you can create those in Management Studio.
Yep.
So hooray. Okay. So taking a peek at some of the other integrations. So 18.7, and I'm skipping around here a little bit. You'll forgive me.
So 18.7, by the way, that was a while ago.
Yeah, that was a little while ago. But this was the introduction of the Azure Data Studio installation integration, right? So now when you install Management Studio, you automatically get Azure Data Studio. So
right, the can of worms edition of SSMS.
Exactly. So
I remember
things,
that.
Right? Yeah.
People were mad.
Yep. And I think for legitimate reason, it's, hey, we're going to install this other tool. Yes. So personally, I understand. Personally, I don't have a strong problem with it. Right. I mean, I use Azure Data Studio on a regular basis, so not a big deal there. But if you're in an environment where I need to get every tool cleared through security, or I need to have things approved before I'm allowed to install it, and then suddenly this other application just shows up.
Surprise.
Then people start asking questions of, well, that's not on the approved list. Who installed this? And it is a full installation as well. This is
right. It's not like a shell or an installer type thing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I can see some concerns there. I also see risks of, well, is it being kept up to date? Is this being patched and managed? Assuming that you don't use Azure Data Studio, the only way in which you possibly would use it is through the integrations with SSMS. And in that case, basically the only way it gets patched is with you updating Management Studio, because you're not going and opening up Azure Data Studio yourself.
Right. Yes, they're somewhat tied. And so this is interesting. So this, you've mentioned you're using Azure Data Studio. And so interestingly enough, one of the features we'll talk about today might increase usage, but there was kind of this question of what tool should we be using? And, and so I guess, so Kevin, as you've mentioned, you're using both of them. How do you decide which one you want to use?
Depends a lot on what I'm working on, where I'm at. So my work machine, mostly Management Studio, because I have tools that make things much nicer for me to use Management Studio. For personal projects, it's almost all Azure Data Studio, because personal projects, I'm using Visual Studio Code day in and day out, and having that similar interface is kind of pleasant. It's fairly easy to work with, and so it's also faster to open, faster to close, faster to keep going.
Right.
So I'm kind of happy about all
loaded,
those.
if you will. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, the VS Code shell is much faster to start up than the Visual Studio shell.
Right. Yeah. Interesting. So I have to admit, I've been, I stay in Management Studio as well. I tend to do the Azure Data Studio for things like this, right? Like, hey, what's new? Or, because I don't have a need necessarily to separate my projects like that, at least right now. Did you have a take, Eugene?
Well, I just keep trying to decide whether or not to say anything. So recently I did a little tiniest bit of work in VS Code, right? And I'm sincerely impressed at how good it is. So the example was I was for a project that's under NDA, so I can't give you any details. I'm writing some Python code to create some simulated data so that we can basically create some machine learning models off of that, right? Okay. So basically trying to create a data set that has particular distractors and all that kind of stuff. And I don't know how long this has been around. Kevin will probably tell me it's been there since day one, but the support for Python is just like amazing, right? It's basic stuff where Python is not a typed language. And so historically, IntelliSense and that kind of stuff for Python was a pain because you would say, okay, it has this variable, but there's no way for the system to know automatically that
Hey,
it's
I'm
this
putting
data
in a
type.
variable now, right? Yeah.
Yeah, right. This is the variable and this is the data type because it's not a compiled, strongly typed language.
Right.
But with VS Code, it's smart enough to go, oh, well, I see in the initialization function, you're setting this variable. And I see you're calling datetime.now or whatever. So it's probably a date time. And so the IntelliSense, all that stuff, it just works, right? And so like I've just been utterly impressed with, as someone who like hasn't had to write Python code in years, was able to just jump in and started getting all these convenience features, which is very well done.
Yeah, very
And,
cool.
and so if I was doing code in and day out, I would definitely want a database tool like Azure Data Studio that's has that similar functionality for sure.
Yeah, VS Code has some nice Python built-in functionality. A lot of the major benefit comes from really good community with extensions. Being able to install linters, test libraries, being able to get nice extensions. That's whenever I develop Python code, it's pretty much always in VS Code.
Very cool. Okay, so one of the versions, so 18.5, and I was going to ping you about this, and you'll forgive me for doing it while we've hit the record button. But they added support for Power BI endpoints in analysis services.
Okay.
So that was 18.5. So I guess you can.
I can pretend to talk like what I know I'm talking about, right? So I think that's XMLA endpoints, I want to say.
Yeah.
Okay.
You're correct.
Yeah. And so that's a big deal because there's a lot of premium capacity style functionality that having access to those endpoints opens up. So it's one of those things that I haven't had to manage a lot of premium capacity, so I haven't had to do a ton with that. But I know from reading various blog posts and things that that's a pretty big deal. So that's exciting functionality.
There we go. 18.4, some query store updates, lots of configuration options, looks like. So 18.2 introduced the, I'm sorry.
18.2 broke Polybase for Windows authentication.
Oh, there we go.
Oh, sorry. No, I'm sorry. I'm thinking SQL Server 2019 CU2. That one we burned into memory forever.
Oh,
18.2. Sorry, did not break anything.
Yeah.
It's just
on
getting
the management studio side, not on the.
Yeah, it's just getting residual mental flack from CU2.
Sure.
Yeah, and it's got a tool in it. Shoot it.
Yeah, really.
Pretty much, yeah.
So introduced a SQL assessment API. Now, this sounds like a future podcast episode to me. But ultimately, right? So I'll just read the note here. So the SQL assessment API provides a mechanism to evaluate the configuration of your SQL Server for best practices. The API is delivered with a rule set containing best practice rules suggested by the SQL Server team. And then there are various ways, right, using PowerShell or whatnot to be able to integrate. The examples, at least the PowerShell was a whole lot. And I'll admit I haven't used it, but I didn't quite see how all the PowerShell was going to be helpful in Management Studio. But again, the dots just haven't connected there. But that's something that we'll probably circle back to.
And it's a good topic. The assessment API, I think the rules that they've put in place are a really good starting point. These are also the same rules that they run in Azure if you have Azure SQL Database, or if you have SQL Server VMs with the agent installed. They cover a lot of good scenarios. I won't try to think of any off the top of my head, but
Sure.
It's the standard type of stuff of have you set this up? Have you configured this correctly? Do you have relevant data points captured in terms of what needs to be encrypted? Have you possibly thought about doing encryption using various mechanisms? Have you made sure that you have non-sysadmin users, non-sysadmin logins? Those types of things where they're not groundbreaking. They're not revelatory in the sense that, oh, wow, nobody's ever thought of this before. But they are very useful in the sense of, I'm a new DBA. I'm not quite sure what I have to do here.
Sure.
Or I'm a DBA in a new situation. I don't know what these servers look like. Being able to run that kind of assessment gives you a quick checklist of, here are things that I should at least look at.
Right.
Even if I'm going to eventually disagree and say, no, that's okay, at least it gives me an opportunity to look at it.
Right. Yeah, in the tools that I'm already using, right? And I don't have to
Correct.
download anything else or, pay for it. It's embedded in the tool there.
Yeah, so that integration is solid.
Right.
And I have used it.
Oh, there we go. So I didn't say this at the beginning, but the version 18 was ultimately support for SQL Server 2019. Right. So if you're running 2019, you don't see compatibility level 150, it's because you're on an older version of SQL Server Management Studio. I'm sure by now it's annoyed you enough to be like, hey, new version, right? That you've upgraded. But just in case, right? That's why. And another one that I found interesting, so 18.1, and again, because it's the SQL Server 2019, they added support for, I won't attempt to tell you the name because but they added a collision type. And I'll be honest, I can't decide whether I am annoyed or impressed that we keep adding collations. Just it seemed odd to me, right? Like,
yeah, were these the UTF-8 Collisions?
Yes, they were.
Okay. Yeah, those had a very narrow use case, like extremely narrow, if I recall. Because I remember long blog posts. I forget who I was, but I remember I did some initial like what's new in 2019. Like presentations way back, and I remember a blog post by someone I should know, but they
Solomon Rutsky.
Thank you. They went through and it's basically like, okay, you want to use this UT8 encoding to save space. Well, here's all these other options. Oh, and by the way, because you're using UTF-8, if you use anything that's outside of the like single byte code block or whatever, it actually either takes the same amount of space or substantially more because it's so skewed towards the first like 127 characters, 256 characters of like the whole ASCII range kind of thing.
Yep.
So like it's useful in a very narrow set of circumstances is my recollection.
Yeah. Solomon's written quite a bit on the topic.
I appreciate Kevin and his eidetic, just photographic memory.
Oh, well, he's also a buddy of mine. He lives in the area.
Gotcha.
It's nice to have friends, No,
Low
very
people
cool.
in high places. Yes.
Yeah, there we go. So we'll have to get those if you'll link us to his blog. We'll make sure we get those in the show notes for those who have nothing, who need
who enjoy reading about collations in their
say
time.
No offense to the author, right? But who might need some sleeping material.
Sure. I got
unique edge cases. Okay, so that's kind of SQL Server Management Studio, right? So now let's go ahead and jump into Azure Data Studio. And so one of the things here is the first things they point out is Table Designer. And again, I haven't gotten into this very well because I'm not using Azure Data Studio. But one of the things it talked about is using the metadata, table metadata features. And I remember having to do this with extended properties, right? In Management Studio, if you ever wanted to do that. And it was kind of a pain in the rear. Just was, kind of clunky. But the table, the table designer looks like it's a nice feature. Have either of you two gotten into that?
I have not.
No, it looks a lot like the designer in Visual Studio or in VS Code if you're using the table designer there. Right. So functionally, it's very similar. Probably a little better than what you get in Management Studio, a little bit more developer oriented. But at the same time, it also gets annoying enough that I just rather write the T-SQL.
Yeah.
Now, you can write the T-SQL. There is a script block for writing in T-SQL. And even though in the image and the link that Carlos has in the show notes, so go check out those show notes, it reads script preview. You can actually edit the script.
Oh, very nice. Yeah, it's kind of a live, the live editor there.
Yeah. So connecting in properties, extended properties, those I think are a useful feature with Table Designer, but otherwise I would just rather write T-SQL
Right.
and have an easier way of having table properties.
Yeah.
But that's never going to happen. I mean, I shouldn't say never, but
Yeah.
they've been that way for 17 years or so. I'm not sure it's going to change at this point. If
Right.
it does, great. If it makes life easier to add new properties, fantastic. I just don't foresee it happening anytime soon.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, so the approach in my mind is that I see Azure Data Studio as a way to get devs more and more comfortable with a lot of the SQL Server world, right? And so this and the next thing about the query plan viewer we're going to talk about, that's kind of where I see a lot of it, is like what can we do to get devs more and more comfortable writing SQL, and so or even managing their dev servers or something like that. And so
Sure.
from that angle, I feel like this is a bit of a win.
Yeah. So in that, the excitement. So one of the big parodies or disparities, right? I guess, if you will, right? But previously disparities, right, was from the the database administration perspective, and that is a lot of the performance pieces, right? Sure, you can write the code, right, but now I need to get some metrics back about what's going on. So Eugene mentioned, right, they now have a query plan viewer in Azure Data Studio, and
specifically, they had the ability to view execution plans. It was awful. It was horrible.
Okay.
Then the advice was, well, install the Century One Plan Explorer extension for Azure Data Studio, which was less awful until it stopped working. And I don't know if it works now.
I don't know. I don't think that SolarWinds is putting too much investment into that.
No.
Yeah. I'll hold my tongue there, but I will say the last time I tried to use Century One Plan Explorer's extension in Azure Data Studio, it didn't work, but that was a while ago.
Sure.
So
Kevin, if you're listening, right, you want to correct us, Kevin Klein, not Fiesel, Kevin Klein, if you're listening, want to correct us, right, then let us know.
Yeah.
Or Tom LaRock. I guess Tom could also be listening.
That is true. So this query plan viewer is a complete rewrite of the ability to see execution plans in Azure Data Studio. Brings something much closer to what you got with Management Studio in terms of the iconography, in terms of functionality on the screen, but it also integrates a couple of the nicer features from what you get in Century One Plan Explorer.
Right. Yeah, I noticed that from the
top operations.
Yep. Yeah. And
so
being
it's
able
not
to sort,
as nice.
Yeah, you get the grid view, right, of all the operators rather than having to sort through the actual GUI, right? To do that, if you have lots of operators in your plan, right, you can kind of pick and choose a little easier.
Exactly. I think it's still not as nice as what Century One Plan Explorer, the standalone program, offers you, but it's certainly 3 or 4 steps up from the old execution plan viewer in Azure Data Studio,
right?
Which thankfully is no longer going to be there.
Yeah, so I think particularly working, I don't want to say simple, right? But I mean, it becomes more approachable, I think, is probably what we're saying there is, whereas before it was like pulling teeth, right?
More useful,
right? You now have a way to kind of get started and then pull it over. Okay, so the other piece that again I wanted to talk about, we alluded to in the very beginning, and that was notebooks. Now we've been hearing, a bit about notebooks. I know, oh gosh, why can I not? His name is just a SQL Beard.
Rob Sewell.
Rob
Yeah.
Sewell, thank you. I was like Sewell, I couldn't remember his first name. So Rob has blogged a little bit about this, but they have now it says now supports easier keyboard navigation in notebooks without mouse clicking.
Yep.
So
This goes back, actually, I created the ticket for this a long time ago, which was I want Jupyter notebook style keyboard commands because notebooks in Azure Data Studio, very interesting. The ability to run SQL operations through notebooks, very interesting. I like the ability to tie together code and information, code and documentation, bring it all together. Great for things like run books, great for teaching, great for training. So very useful in those regards. Not as good of an experience for developing notebooks because in Azure Data Studio, let's go back fast, rewind to a few months ago. Most operations you had to click with the mouse. If you want to run this thing, you have to run it with the mouse. If you want to add a new cell, click with the mouse. And when you're trying to write something, there's just a lot more mouse clicking than ideal.
Right.
Yeah.
In Jupyter Notebooks, which is different notebook product, kind of the originator of the notebook format.
Yep.
And at least as we know it today,
right.
They have a full set of keyboard functionality, and they have two modes. You have edit mode and you have command mode. And edit mode is you're in a cell, you're doing work, and I want to run the cell, shift enter. I want to alt enter does something else. I forget exactly what. I want to add a new line, it's just enter. There are certain keyboard commands that you can type while you're in a cell and it will do some work. But most of the keyboard commands are actually in the command mode. So you hit escape to close the cell, to kind of step out from behind the cell. And now I can delete a cell using DD. I can add a cell with A, insert a cell with I can move cells up and down. I can move my cursor up and down with cells. I can run individual cells very easily. I can run and move to the next, run and stay in the same. So there's a lot of this kind of keyboard functionality that makes life easier for developers. This is slowly making its way into notebooks for Azure Data Studio. And this one, being able to escape and go up and down and then re-enter edit mode is useful. You can add a new cell by using shift enter and it will create a new cell below. Alt enter actually inserts one in between. If you it'll execute the current cell and then add a new cell right below it, even if there's another one below that.
There you go.
So,
Yeah. So
functionality's getting there.
Right. There you go. So there we go. So Kevin, I guess we have to thank you for this one, right?
Right.
I'm pretty sure my ticket's still open because I asked for all of the Jupyter commands. This is a small number of them, but it's an increasing number.
Sure.
The last few releases I've seen, oh, you're getting closer. Okay, it pieces are coming into place. So hopefully there will be more of that support for shortcuts. Some of it you can manually bind yourself. A lot of it you can't. But that's actually one of the advantages to Azure Data Studio because it uses Visual Studio Code. A lot of the configuration is all just JSON files. So you can rebind any keyboard commands by modifying a JSON file or taking somebody else's JSON file. You can reskin the whole thing. You can make heavy configuration changes if you just know what JSON
you want to update
properties are available.
Yeah, very cool. So it will be interesting to see, how that continues to happen. You triggered my thought in terms of runbook and whatnot, because admittedly that's a project that I am working on, and so now I have been trying to figure out how to make the runbooks a little bit more approachable, and maybe this update will do it for me. So it sounds like something else we could, again, another future topic we could expand out a little bit, perhaps in a future episode. So the last one, which we'll just mention, so the Azure SQL migration extension has been updated, right? Again, it sounds like we probably need to circle back to that. I actually can't remember the last time we talked about the Azure SQL migration. I know it's been a little while, and so as they're they continue to make changes, it's probably worth hitting up again. So compañeros, if you've been doing some heavy lifting, particularly in the last 6 to 8 weeks, right from April 2022, let me know, and we'll get you on. Right, we'd love to kind of get your thoughts on what's happening there. So those are the pieces that I pulled out of the blog post. Anything else that we need to that we should talk about in terms of tooling?
We already talked about notebooks, but again, with some recent work that I've been doing, I've been seeing the light more on that. And in particular, again, this is more on the Python side, but just any situation where you need to run some code and then you need to do some validation that you want to be able to show somebody. Like that's a big deal, being able to do a notebook, right? And I could definitely see that on the SQL side where, you've got maybe some sort of like procedure, stored procedure or something else that you run like once a quarter, or it's doing some data cleansing and you need to be able to run some selects or something else to be able to validate that, okay, it did what it was supposed to, or the counts, the row counts came back the right way, or there's no duplicates or whatever. I could see SQL notebooks being really useful for something like that. So I'm starting, again, I'm 2 or 3 years behind the curve, but I'm starting to become more bullish on notebooks.
Sure. Well, and I mean, in our defense, again, I know that they've been there, but I feel like notebooks for the database are lagging, right? Like we talked about the Juniper notebooks and all the other developer type notebooks.
And there's
more mainstream. Sure.
True. And there's a pretty good reason for that. And the reason is that it's harder.
Yeah, no, that's right.
Just to keep it this way, if you're thinking about, you write a Python notebook or a C# notebook, an F# notebook, which also exist, of course.
Sorry, good.
It's okay. Scala notebooks, whatever. Most structured, procedural, or functional programming languages, you have this concept of state between operations. So your notebook can reflect what is the current state.
Right.
Well, when you're thinking about T-SQL queries, you don't really have state between queries that effectively.
Sure.
And for example, if I declare a variable in one cell and I try to use it in the next cell, that state is gone. It's essentially you're thinking of you've got to go between each one of these statements. So if I want to declare variables at the top and use them further down in a notebook, which is pretty common in notebooks, or if I want them parameterized, then you don't really have that capability easily built in. You can fake it. And one of the ways to fake that would be you take those parameters, you insert them into a temp table. And the temp table can exist between go statements, can exist between batches, and will exist for the session. So you could insert them in there, yank them out kind of as needed. But that's something that we as T-SQL developers don't tend to think about.
Right.
And so the motif of notebooks is a little different from how T-SQL developers are going to interact. And I think that's a part of why it's been so difficult.
Yeah, I've never thought about that, needing to, like, if you're trying to do something that's more like a stored procedure, basically being able to pause in between steps.
Right.
Yeah, I can see how that could be an issue.
Just a small one. Okay.
Right.
Well, very good. Well, I think that then is going to do it for us today, compañeros. Thanks again for tuning in. We do appreciate it. If folks want to get a hold of you, Mr. Eugene, how can they do so?
You can find me on Twitter at SQLgene, and I blog at sqlgene.com.
Mr. Kevin?
So I used to have social media, but then SQL Server 2019 CU2 broke it.
Man. Okay. And compañeros, you can reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm at Carlos L. Chacon. Thanks for tuning in today, and we'll see you on the SQL Trail.
SQL Data Partners.